and welcome back to the NWA 1983 project. I'm your host, Lex G, and with me, as always, is Matt Riley. How you doing tonight, Matt?
Feeling better. Cortisone shots really do help.
All right. You should try Ben Gay.
Oh, no.
Don't get any ideas.
Oh, no.
It's gross. So tonight's episode, we will be doing a closed circuit big event. It'll be Paul Bosch's Houston Wrestling Spectacular live from the Summit in Houston, Texas. There's going to be a lot of great matches on there. You got Ric Flair versus Gino Hernandez on the show.
Ooh.
You have Dusty Rhodes taking on Harley Race for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. So again, this is another show that is completely stacked because if you know how Paul Bosch kind of worked his cards and booked his cards, he would do super shows. That's all he basically did was super shows. So you would have a show with every big star on it, it seemed like, where every match was a main event match. So that's the way he kind of ran his stuff down there. We'll be discussing Houston wrestling in detail coming up soon. But first, I want to talk about some recent stuff in the news. I guess today. It seemed like Kofi Kingston posted a picture. It was the New Day. It was Sasha Banks, and it was Rich Swann, all holding their championship belts. And then a little, I guess, hashtag Black Excellence. I saw the picture earlier today and didn't think anything of it. I just scrolled past. I'm like, oh, that's cool, and moved on. And then all of a sudden, outrage and controversy. So, Matt, what do you think about the photo? And then what's your opinion on that?
The photo's pretty slick. I like the way they did the kind of color scheme.
It looked cool as hell.
For starters, it's a cool color scheme, so well done. Two, I think it's a very cool approach, kind of establishing, them. I want to say like 5 or 6 years ago, there was a picture with I think it was CM Punk and AJ. I want to say a bunch of wrestlers, like one crew. I remember Cody Rhodes was there.
Kofi Kingston was in that picture too.
Yeah, it was they're all the belt holders.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, that's a cool picture. And I think, of course, like most things in life, is the fake racial outrage. How dare you? No one really gives a shit about the negative aspect of it. I think it's a fine thing. I liked it. So I am a proponent of that. I like that Kofi Kingston came out and addressed the controversy right up front, just cut it down.
Yeah, I mean,
which I think is a good thing to do because I think when you wait, it just builds and festers. Come out, bang, done.
So I had a conversation today with someone, and he's like, they asked me point blank, do you think it's racist? I'm like, I was taken aback. I'm like, no, it's not racist. Racist would be like black excellence, white people suck. You know what I mean? So I don't understand the concept.
Well, did you see the hashtag that said "See Whitey Die"? I don't know. I was a little thrown by that, but whatever.
And their response to me was, well, if you had a bunch of white wrestlers on there that said white excellence, people would be upset with it.
Right.
I'm like, number one, I'm not sure how many people would be upset with it. It's not something that's routinely done. I guess white excellence is implied already, right, based on the way kind of wrestling has worked over the last 100 years or so, where the majority of their champions have been white. The majority of the people who are in charge are white. Where a lot of the biggest names and the biggest stars in history have been mostly white.
Right.
Throughout time. So, if you had a picture of a bunch of white people holding belts, culturally speaking, although it's a great accomplishment for them personally, it doesn't affect the overall white population as a whole, where, these guys are making history to a degree. Now, you can say how wrestling is scripted and all these people were handed belts. That goes both ways. These black athletes in wrestling haven't been handed anything.
Right.
And there's been a lot of cases where they probably had, deserved it in the past, being elevated to top spots, and they had missed out for whatever reason. I don't want to really get into, the reasons behind it. And these are all wrestlers that don't have the kind of the racial stereotype attached to them. So it's not like a Nation of Domination picture or a Crime Time picture. Those are not their characters. They're wrestlers first and foremost, so, which is a great thing, which is progress.
Right.
To a degree. But I asked them the question, if you saw a picture of Sheamus, Finn Balor, and Becky that said Irish excellence, would you be offended? And then I asked them if you had a picture of Nakamura and Asuka that said Japanese excellence, would you be offended? He said he would be. Well, okay, that seems like more of a you issue than a picture issue.
Right. I think if you had... I get what they're trying to go with it. You know, I saw someone, one of the picture things I read earlier about at lunch, it was like, oh, if this was a bunch of white dudes, you know, people be saying it's wrong. And it's sort of like the whole thing about there's no real, try to articulate this the right way. I don't feel there's a per se white pride. There's, like, I grew up, for example, my family are mutts. Right. I'm all over Europe. Italy, Portugal, you know, mostly Scottish, Irish, English, Wales, Austrian, you name it, French, right? And my mother, for a while, we went through this Irish phase.
Okay.
Where she was cooking Irish food all the time, which I hated, except mashed potatoes. You know, but like I was like, we're Irish now? Okay. You know, and my grandma would always be like, oh, good Scotch blood, you know. But I never went to a parade. I had friends that grew up like doing the jig dancing, which I hated. I thought it just looked bizarre. But you know, that's a cultural thing. I had friends that I grew up with that were Jewish. They went through, like, you know, bat mitzvahs and, you know, all the different things. I didn't have a quinceanera, like a friend. I didn't have that happen in my neighborhood. It was all Italian, Portuguese, and Jewish.
Right.
And then some mixes, you know. But I never got the allure of, like, going to, like, a Polish-American club. Because I felt like, well, I don't associate myself that strongly to any one nationality.
Well, that's the thing, too. I think most Caucasian people don't, a lot of them don't even identify, like, when you ask them, hey, what are you? They don't go like, I'm white. They usually say, like, oh, I'm half Italian, half Irish. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So it's different. And right. I had asked him, do you think, because he went back to the thing where, well, they're all Americans. I'm like, that's very true. My response to that is like, do you think white American culture is different than black American culture? Because it is. I hate to stomp on everyone's parade, but it is different culturally. But it's weird. It's a weird thing. You know, if someone posted something, you know, white excellence and basketball, I think we were talking about this earlier, right? Or a sport where it's been dominated by black people historically. Olympic marathons. You know, the 40-meter dash, and if a white guy happened to win it, and he said white pride or white excellence, I don't think I'd be offended by that.
Right.
Than being prideful in your race.
Right. I will say this, that, you know, when it comes to like around here, like the Polish American clubs, the Italian American clubs, there's the Portuguese clubs. There, you know, it's for me, it was always a thing where you noticed. This is often people culturally came to an area and they hadn't quite absorbed into it yet, so they kind of had their cultural network, right? So yeah. Then you'd have people who just were like, well, I wouldn't go to those things because that's not me.
Right.
I don't have anything against them. I mean, that's fine, you know, whatever. But, you know, for sake of your argument about the wrestlers deserving the push, if New Day were not as innovative, entertaining, and fast on their feet, and all above all else, able to perform as wrestlers, they wouldn't have those belts.
Right.
You know, like someone above said, okay, hey, so when you think of how long it took Ron Simmons to win that first world title for a person of African American descent, or, you know, I remember when The Rock was in his heyday, and I never once thought to myself, and this is, I'm not saying I didn't recognize the fact that he was a African American or had a, you know, multicultural background. That wasn't why I watched.
No.
You know, we talked earlier about Ron Simmons. Like, you know, they didn't give New Day those belts because they wanted some black guys to have a belt in the kind of culture we're living in. That wouldn't work. You know, it's like if they had no skill, it wouldn't work. You know, and you see in the NFL with people like, well, he's a black quarterback, and the way they describe black quarterbacks often, you know, well, he's very articulate. Fuck's that mean?
Right.
You know, like, I mean, I get that, but like, you don't say a white guy, well, he's a very articulate. You hear well-spoken or gentleman, you know, and I mean, come on. I just feel like a lot of times on the internet, these things take off, and they don't get addressed.
Right.
And then they catch a wildfire. It's like almost like a wildfire. You know, they spread, the brush goes, you know, and all of a sudden 10 acres are gone. Then 100 acres are gone. So to bring this around, like politically, if you don't squash a rumor immediately and address it, it grows. Well, Kofi Kingston came out this afternoon and was like, oh yeah, guess what? And he explained it all very well, how he felt about it, and that, you know, the moment of pride, you know. I'm a Kofi Kingston fan. I saw him on, can't think of the show. It was on Sci-Fi Channel. It was like some like Stonehenge type show.
Yeah.
And he was on as like a guest for whatever reason. He knew somebody, I guess. And he's a cool dude. He's from BC. You know, my nephew goes to BC, so it's kind of a cool background. So it's nice to see guys that you root for do well. And I also like the fact when people you root for or you enjoy their work are good at explaining themselves in a sense of like, okay, calm the fuck down. Here's what's going on. That's a good resource to have. And I think, unfortunately, especially in the current political climate, we've had too many people who just never address things, so they either just go into the wind, because by the time you think about that one controversy, you know, like with Trump, there's 5 others. You know, it's like, all right, I can't get pissed about the Russians because he just talked about punching this hill man in the face, you know, whatever it may be. I really think it was a cool picture. Good. You know, it was funny at first, like, okay, it's Rich Swann. And I'm like, oh, Sasha, all right, cool.
You know, it never occurred to me that Sasha's black.
I know, same thing. And it goes back to the Rock thing. I don't think of her as like, you know, whatever. Because also you mentioned the fact that, you know, they don't play off the racial stereotypes, which is cool. I mean, they make jokes and everything else. That's fine. But they don't, to me at least, they don't come out as like,
you know, they're not your Kamalas.
Right. Kamala, Dr. Styles, Slickster, you know,
even Bad News Brown to a certain degree.
Right.
Again, I think we need to start talking about things and stop being super outraged about nothing.
Right.
And you can have the dialogue and you can ask the question. It's like, hey, do you think this is in poor taste or not? And then we can have the dialogue back and forth. And, you know, maybe I can, you know, if we have differing opinions, I can change yours, you can change mine, or it gives you better understanding. But just to kind of pump your fist and slam your hand down and say, oh, this is, you know, they're racist, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
Which is a lot of the stuff I've been seeing online. I think it's completely ridiculous. And we need to start actually talking to each other instead of just yelling at each other.
I think what happens a lot also with, especially with race discussions, is that people are afraid to talk about it openly. So when you start talking, like I had a person who on Facebook who made a post on something I had posted, and she suddenly went into a very dark area. And she's a professional real estate sales, like she has an online site and everything.
Right.
And I was kind of like giving her some rope to like, you know, I don't think you mean that. And she was like, you know, digging herself deeper. And then she's like, you're a racist. And I'm like, you know, what are you talking about? And all of a sudden, all that stuff she said is gone.
Right.
And I really feel that people realize at some point, because right now...
Because sometimes people say crazy shit just to win an argument.
Right.
Even stuff that they don't even mean. You know, they're just trying to win.
Right. Not a finger! Sorry, I've been watching Chris's movies all week.
Ridiculous. So speaking of stupidity, shenanigans, and tomfoolery, Matt, did you happen to read that story about Kevin Steen and the kid?
He's a monster. He's a monster. Take the belt off him, suspend him, and never let him work again until he apologizes to every fan he's insulted.
So apparently, I guess it was over the weekend, there was a kid in the audience. He wanted to give Kevin Owens a high five. And Kevin Owens, you know, being a heel, gave him the business. He basically said, go buy this shirt. He basically told the kid, you know, go buy his shirt. And then he changed his mind. He's like, I don't want you ever wearing one of my shirts. And don't ever try to touch me. And that was the extent of the conversation that we had with the kid.
Right.
So apparently the mom got really upset, had this complaint online, and she kind of was overblown on her part.
Right.
So she was upset that her kid was upset. And he may not want to go to wrestling shows anymore.
That's probably the best.
I don't understand the concept of, oh my God, the bad guy wrestler was mean to me. That's kind of ridiculous to me. And it's funny because Kevin Owens said the exact same thing to a buddy of mine at a Ring of Honor show.
Is your friend okay now?
He just stopped crying last week. So my buddy was wearing a Kevin Steen shirt, but it was an older one that he got like, you know, a couple months prior. And Kevin Owens is like, why are you wearing that shirt? Go buy my new shirt. And my friend promptly went on intermission and bought a brand new Kevin Owens shirt.
There you go.
So this is part of his shtick that he's done. I don't understand the outrage, and And you can probably speak to this better than I can, since you're in the business and stuff like that. What's the line you want to cross where you're being a heel, but you make people not want to come to your show anymore?
Okay, I would say my line, one of the things I was told was spot one mark on each side of the ring. The idea being, if you're a heel, you can, like I get thrown out of the ring or I get drop kicked, I fall out of the ring and the fans cheer. When I pop up, I should, smack the ring, the apron in frustration, turn around, see them laughing and respond. And if I pick somebody out, that mark that I've noticed, that mark is usually somebody who's vocal, gullible, but you don't want to pick on someone who's, I don't want to say unable to defend themselves, but like you almost want to pick on someone that other people around them have to get up for them.
Right.
So it's a fine line. Because let's say, for example, like at one of the shows, I picked on a guy. Within like 5 seconds of yelling back and forth, I realized there was something wrong with this guy. Like mentally wrong. Asterisk, spoiler alert, that's a part of the business. There's a lot of fans in this of different mindsets.
Yeah.
And that's fine. I mean, it's part of life in general. But when you communicate as a normal person, you'd say, "Oh, excuse me." When you communicate as a wrestler, if you're a heel and you tell them you're an ugly cuss, blah blah blah, in one aspect, you want to keep the illusion of the business. That's part of what you do. You sit there and you create a character. Now, it's sort of like going to a haunted house, right? You go to a haunted house, you get grabbed by the ankle, someone jumps out, you scream, you don't have them go, "Well, are you okay? Are you okay? You look scared." No, you'd be like, "Ah, oh shit," and you move on. Well, same idea. You go to a movie, you engage you disable reality, you enjoy it, you come out and you go about your business. And I feel that for someone in this position to play that card, you're not keeping an aspect of what the show's about. He's a bad guy. He's supposed to be your number one bad guy because he's a champion. He does an excellent job. He's good on the mic. He's creative. If you follow him on Twitter, which I do, you enjoy his work because he mocks his fans, and the people that make fun of him, he's like, blocked, he makes it a good, entertaining thing. If it is too much to go to a show and, expect them to break character for your needs and screw everybody else, it's not what it's about, and I think this woman, like Owens had a tweet later on where he said, he's a picture of him face down on the ramp, and it says, "A wrestler told my son not to touch him. I'm completely heartbroken. ... Well, not really, but if I complain, maybe I'll get free stuff." Yeah, pretty much. I agree with that. Now, as a babyface, it kind of turns all around. You want those fans to like you. You want those fans. You want those fans. I remember one show, I think it was in Porterdale. After the show, this guy was talking to me, and these two kids came over and they were saying something to me, and I couldn't understand them. So I paused and I was like, "I'm sorry, what?" And they were both deaf, and but they could kind of talk. So I had to kind of really listen hard, and I signed something for them. If I was a complete asshole, bad guy, and I went out there and made fun of kids like that if I knew that was going on with them, that's to me a little bit low, because you don't go to the show to have your kid come off with a complex.
Right.
But to me, when your kid gets yelled at by the bad guy and he says, "Don't buy my shirt. I don't want you buying my shirt," you should go, "Oh, boo," boo him.
Right.
That's what you're supposed to do, and move on to the next thing. They're not all good guys. There's some bad guys, and you can't have these good guys if you want. Like the old story of the hero's only as good as his villain. You can't have that if you have everyone just being like, "Hey, what's cool?" That's why I've always liked certain events where you almost never see certain guys break character. Like Undertaker almost never ever shows up for those little memento things.
Yeah.
He stays in character, and that's fine. More guys can learn from that. Like the whole tweeting thing. You see, I think it's a meme with Harley Race, and he's like, it's a joke one, but it's like, Harley Race never thanked his opponent on Facebook.
Yeah.
Well, damn right. I mean, I see that sometimes. I have friends that are wrestlers, and I see them like, back and forth. Like, that was a good match, yo. Unless you're fan favorites and you're in a respect type match, one thing. But if you're a heel, stay in character. It shows a commitment. I'm not saying you have to like go to the supermarket and people say, "Oh, I saw you wrestling." Like, fuck you, I'm a heel, and smash them with a watermelon. But
you could.
You could.
Harley Race would have done it.
I would not want to go shopping with Harley Race. Kevin Owens is awesome. I enjoy his work.
And it's funny because he has kids, and I think if anyone knows what's appropriate and what's inappropriate for a child, would be a father. You know what I mean? Number one, he's a father. Number two, he's a long-time wrestling fan. So he's been to shows. He knows what it's like. I think he has a complete understanding. And that was an opportunity for that kid to stand up for himself. Now, if that kid would have gave him the finger or something like that, that kid would have been made. He'd been the biggest baby face in the arena.
Yep.
If my son's 10 years old, and I would teach my son to stand up for yourself and don't be scared and that kind of
right,
all that jazz. And I would be proud of my kid, like, Kevin Owens, you suck. Here's the finger.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yep. And that's the thing about it. You're supposed to play along. You don't sit there and go, but you said I'm blah, 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 blah. Like, dude, play along. Now, like I said, if you had someone, I'll back up. I went to a show once in Boston, and it's how long ago? It was the 1, 2, 3 kid was wrestling.
Oh boy.
I'm being a jerk because I'm like a early 20s smart mark in the stands being an asshole.
Mm-hmm.
So I start chanting, 3, 2, 1, 3, 2, 1. And there was a whole row of people of varying abilities in front of us.
Yeah.
And one of them got up and got on my face and was like, no! 1, 2, 3! And he wasn't joking. He was legit pissed.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, okay. Now, I could have sat there and made fun of him, but at a certain point, you got to kind of draw the line. And that's how I think, when you ask what the line to me is someone who can't defend themselves. In this case with the kid, that kid's mother is the real villain here.
Yeah, I agree.
Like, your kid's a coddled little baby, then you know what? You've made that happen.
Yeah.
Don't helicopter, don't whatever. I see it all the time on public, too. You see parents who... There's a difference between having a child who might have a problem and just being a dick parent.
Right.
I remember one time there was a woman with 4 or 5 kids, and she was ignoring them, and the nanny was with them all.
Mm.
And my friend and I were like, oh, what's going on here? And she's like, oh, she's very busy. She's writing a book. We were like, oh, what's she writing about? Parenting. And I was like, is chapter 1, hire a nanny? Ta-da! Okay. Well, in this case, I would say if you bring the parent and the kid back to an event, cut them apart. I would have Owens just destroy, have them the old, I'm going to bring, you know what, I feel really bad. Let's have a moment here. And I got you a shirt with your name on it. And have the kid's last name and then rip it in half.
It's like, you remember when...
You don't deserve it.
You remember when Ted DiBiase did the stuff with the kids? And if you can dribble the basketball 10 times, I'll give you $500. And then the kid went to number 9, he fucking kicked the wall away.
Right.
Or the kid with the push-ups. And it was ridiculous. Did the WWE pay those kids afterwards? Yes.
Yeah.
But still, they did. No one's feeling bad for those kids.
No.
You know what I mean? So it's whatever, dude. I mean, it's just between that and the guy who complained about John Cena not coming to his show, coming to the show in his neighborhood because he was out injured.
Right.
Don't come back.
Right.
It's we don't need you.
Yeah, guys like that want, at a certain point, when you're just being, this kind of obnoxious, no one gives a shit.
No.
Just give it a rest. And I hope in this situation that, parents will understand this is an interactive show. It really is interactive theater. So you've got to join in. Don't sit there aghast when a heel calls you out.
Right.
As a heel wrestler, if I look at the crowd and I give you heat and I throw you something, right? And your response is to go, and I get nothing back from you, I have 2 choices. Keep going or move on.
Right.
And moving on can simply be like, look, you see? Say, shut up. You know what to do? Shut your mouth. Move on. You're going to shut up too? Or you're going to give me lip? And you draw them, because there's always going to be some jerk in the stands who gets it. Their job is to come back ratchet and go, hey, go to hell. Like I was watching that WWE Troops thing tonight, and there was a really funny part where the Miz came out, and he did an open challenge, and he was like, you know what, I want to take a moment and recognize the inspiration that I am to the military. It's a good line.
It's good to eat.
I like the Miz.
It's good to eat. It's like the guy in the front row that Ric Flair's been calling a fat boy for 20 years. He probably has a complex. It's probably the same. It's probably the same guy too.
Turns out it's Dr. Phil. All these years, it's Dr. Phil.
Ridiculous.
Oh man. All right. Yeah. So that's my take on that.
I hate people.
Sissy parents equals shut up.
It's hard. It's hard. And I'm a parent. Yeah, and it being a parent can be frustrating at times. Sometimes your kid acts like an asshole, and you got to try to fix that, and it's not easy. It's hard, and
right.
The first thing you want to do when your kid's in that situation is to coddle them and baby them and that kind of stuff. For some parents, it's in their instincts,
right?
To really spoil and to really coddle your children, and you have to work against that kind of instinct for some of us. Other people don't have that issue, but it can be difficult. So I understand it from that point of view. If that was my son, that's a conversation on the way home. It's like, if someone's going to make fun of you, you gotta step up. You gotta step up to the plate.
Right.
Your dad's right here. It's like he's not going to do anything to you. You know what I mean? And that's a whole different conversation. That being said, if you bring your kids to the show and he'll yell at you, yell something back. How about that?
Yeah, it again. It goes back to it's an interactive show.
Mm-hmm.
If it was the theater, you were at going to see Noises Off, and Frederick stops and goes, "Hey, jerk in 5C, shut it!" And it's some kid who's sitting there like, "What?" Like maybe he's on his phone, he's not paying attention.
Right.
I get it, but just move on.
So next up, I want to have a quick conversation regarding selling in professional wrestling. I was asking myself this question the other day. Does the way that professional wrestlers sell make wrestling look fake? And here's where I'm coming from this, because on the surface, you're like, no, they sell to make it look real. Basically, where it came from was I kept on seeing these things online. It's like, these guys are killing the business. They don't sell. Selling makes wrestling look realistic. So I'm like, selling makes wrestling look realistic. And I'm watching. I'm like, no, it fucking doesn't. Now, what selling does, selling gives you the ability to tell a great story. It makes the match exciting. It doesn't make it look realistic. Right. Let's be clear on that. Because if you watch any other combat sports, you watch UFC, you watch boxing, when a boxer gets punched in the face with a good punch, he doesn't fucking sell it. He doesn't go into a weeble wobble unless he's about to get knocked the fuck out.
Yeah.
And UFC, if they go with a leg kick, those guys are not selling kicks like Randy Savage after WrestleMania 8. They shrug it off. And in wrestling, you take a body slam and someone says, my back, oh. I can make an argument that makes it look fake. That it makes it not look realistic. Now, the art of selling has an art that's been lost to a certain degree overall. But don't tell me that selling makes wrestling look realistic, because it doesn't. What it does, it enhances the story of the match. It makes it exciting. It does all those things. That's why wrestling should not ever get rid of selling. But to have the argument that makes it look realistic, I think, is a ridiculous statement. What do you think, Matt?
Well, I will say this. I think that the reason you have selling in wrestling as opposed to UFC or MMA, etc., things like that, is that it is not a legit competition.
Right.
So it is a performance. It is theater, whether you like it or not. Now, there are times when they try to make things, more realistic, King of Hearts style or things like that. It's a physical competitor, clothesline. It has an air of realism, elements of the toughness. But what you're missing is that when somebody gets legit punched, they don't have to sell because they're getting punched. I had a spot one time where the manager of the bad guy I was fighting, Vic Rhodes, his manager, Backstabbing Bob, was going to punch me with a chain. So backstage, I was like, all right, let's work on this. And I'm trying to show him how to throw a fake punch, and he kept punching me in the side of the head. It's like, all right, you're going to stomp me. Let's work on a stomp. So he was kicking me. And I'm like, all right, let's work on you stomping me from the side the easiest way possible. I think what happens with selling is there needs to be degrees. And I was explaining this the other day in the LWF meeting that you need degrees. For instance, paper cut, a 2, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, stub your toe on a table in the middle of the night, a 4. You go to throw a glass and it hits the wall, breaks open, you slash open your hand, you hit a nerve, you're effed. It's a 7. You fall out of a tree, 8. You know, like there's varying levels. Well, same thing in wrestling. If you sell an arm bar the same way you sell a figure 4 leg lock, well, you're a terrible performer.
Right.
You just are. You have to have levels. And that's why the reason you need selling in wrestling, and like when I was being trained, Killer would always say, okay, someone's giving you a step over toe hold, right? Fight it. Don't just lay there and take it. You're supposed to be fight. It's a fight. Act like you're, going to fight them. Don't just take it. And what you see a lot is wrestlers that just basically feed them their leg, feed them the arm, feed them their head. And it looks less legit. Now, I'm not saying that's the end of the world. We've seen John Cena call spots on TV for 20 years now almost. It's just how it goes. But you don't insult my intelligence. I used to always use the example for acting class when I was doing acting training. If I'm in a scene and I've been shot in the arm to start the play, right? So act 1, I run to the room, I have blood pouring down my arm, and I'm holding it. I was shot off screen before it started. And the whole entire play, I'm bleeding and I talk about fatigue from blood loss. If at the end of the show, I reach for the door with my arm that was shot and pull it open despite how it's locked, every audience goes, what? Well, it's kind of the same way with wrestling. If you work my arm the whole entire match and I finish you with a gorilla press slam and I push you up 3 times, it just looks stupid.
Yeah.
Now, again, it's wrestling. We know that's predetermined. I hate people go, oh, it's fake. If it was fake, my shoulder would look like garbage. It's like, there's a difference, Predetermined, it's like dancing. The better your partner, the better it will look. So if you sell well, you have those degrees. There was a book I had as a kid, and it was Marvel Comics, How to Draw the Marvel Way. And there was this panel, which I always took and equated to wrestling. And it was Spider-Man throwing a punch. And you had him on one side of the page, kind of like reaching as far back as possible. And then on the other side, like delivering the punch. So picture like rearing back, then following through. And that middle zone was what they called the avoid zone. Like, it looks terrible. Killer used to talk about if the fans in the upper bleachers or upper deck can see you winding up, that's good. You want them to see that. Now, as the person delivering it, I want to deliver a very, vivid visual feast for the person watching. If I wind up and I slug you and you don't sell it, it tells you one or two things. Either you have no idea how to sell a move, or B, you're Hulk Hogan and you're hulking up.
Or Road Warrior Hulk.
Or Road Warrior Hawk, yeah.
And I want people to understand the difference between registering and selling. Now,
Right.
You can always register damage. If you get punched, you register the damage. That's when you move your head back and forth. You can go into the long sell on the ground when you're selling your shoulder, you're selling your arm. I think from overall performance standpoint, it is extremely necessary, and especially when you talk about a live event that you want everyone from the front row to the guy in the cheap seats seeing what you're doing. So everything's going to be very exaggerated. Now, we're talking about real sports, boxing. They're not really in it for the entertainment purposes. They're in it to win it. So, again, if they get hit, they're not going to have the exaggerated movement.
Right.
But in terms of it being realistic, no, not necessarily realistic when you're in a competition type thing. The idea is you're trying to compete to win. You're trying to emulate combat sports. So, again, it's a very interesting discussion. I don't think there's any one right answer. I think there's a lot of gray area there. There's people who don't sell at all, and their match looks like shit, and there's people who oversell.
Right.
And that's almost worse.
And I think there are times when you can oversell that are allowed versus times when you don't. There was that Shawn Michaels match against Hogan.
Yeah.
Where he sold it like basically to be like F you.
Yeah.
And it worked because to me, I wanted him to tell him to fuck off. And then there was a great moment where I think it was called the greatest SmackDown finish ever. and like everyone delivers their finisher, and it's like, Kurt Angle runs in, Undertaker runs in, Kane runs in, Shane McMahon runs in.
That's a dog and pony show.
Right, and then at the end, he gives a stunner to The Rock again, and he does like the whole like falls back and spits up, and you compare that. Okay, The Rock taking a stunner and making it look a little cartoonish. To the other side of the spectrum, someone like Donald Trump or Linda McMahon taking the stunner so awfully, so awkwardly. It reminds me of Gary Hart on his best day. Sorry, Gary Hart's my personal pet peeve when he bumped the worst. But yeah, I really do believe that selling in wrestling has its place, but you can tell the guys who are the best at it because they know just enough how to sell.
Right.
There are guys that I think one of the hidden tricks of selling is being still. Like, I used to do a thing where I would lay down. I remember one time I got hit in the head with a can, and after the match, I just laid there and, like, just on my side and talked to the ref softly. Mm-hmm. And people thought I was legit hurt because I wasn't getting up.
Right.
And then one time they burned me. I was so pissed. I brought fire paper into the back room, and it was like an old Dusty Rhodes thing. That looks cool. I'll do it. But I brought it in. Oh. And I ended up getting burned.
Rock and Roll Express, make sure you put some of those bandanas on me, baby.
Right. Thanks, Dusty. But it was just a thing, like, I had my face, and, like, people bought into it. They thought, oh, wow, you really hurt. Because we put a bunch of Vaseline on the side of my neck and, like, bandages over it and, whatever, after the show. It's rigged goof, it is what it was. But I really believe that, it can make the difference. And I think if you... Like anything, there's a great meme, actually. This reminds me of a great meme where it's like Stephanie McMahon, and it says her first part of it saying, so you don't watch wrestling because it's fake. And then the next one's saying her something effective like, so tell me about the TV shows and the movies you watch.
Yeah.
I mean, like, it's just a different type.
Do you think the referees should be selling big moves, too?
Yes.
Like with their reactions and facials?
I will say that my favorite referee of all time was Tommy Young, because he sold the moment. There was a fantastic match between Flair and Barry Windham that actually made me want to get into wrestling. Mm. And there was a point where Barry almost pinned him, like Flair just got out, and Tommy Young like cringed and like looked. He sold this look of like, oh, I'm sorry, you were so close. It was awesome, and I think that's the thing. Whether it's the fans, the ref, the camera crew, if you sell shock on all levels, people buy into it, So
yeah,
I feel it has its place in wrestling, but you have to do it right.
Absolutely.
Training.
So obviously, what you're watching on the screen is our Paul Bosch Houston Spectacular. So we're going to talk a little bit about Houston wrestling. Houston wrestling started out in the mid 1920s and ran until 1987. Originally, it was run by the Siegel family, but then it kind of reached its heights under Paul Bosch. Again, Houston wrestling was big early on. They had shows right before World War I, but it was pretty irregular. Again, it was irregular from 1915 to 1923. But the first person to really promote in Houston was Julius Siegel, who ran the Houston City Auditorium. In 1929, when Siegel left to promote shows in New Orleans and in Shreveport, Louisiana, his brother Morris Siegel took over the promotion down to Houston. At that point, again, Morris Siegel wasn't really known for his wrestling acumen.
Okay.
But he did work with someone, a Brooklyn wrestler named Paul Bosch. Basically became one of Morris Siegel's main men. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is kind of the way Houston wrestling worked and the way wrestling worked in Texas. Now, there's a difference between a territory and a booking office. A booking office would be a promoter or a person who would be the person who was the booker, right? They would basically send out wrestlers to different cities. Now, back in the day, each city kind of had their own local promoter. Like even WWF had it back in the day too. So in terms of Texas, the booking office was out of Houston.
Okay.
So they would send wrestlers to Dallas. They would send wrestlers to San Antonio. They would send wrestlers to Amarillo, and what other cities and territories they had in there. So Houston itself wasn't a territory like we know what, like Georgia or Crockett. It wasn't a territory kind of like that because they had relied on the booking office. Now, when Morris Siegel had passed away, Paul Bosch thought, he's going to keep the booking office and he's going to be in charge of, wrestling and all that kind of good stuff. But then in a power play, Fritz von Erich took the booking office to Dallas, and it kind of cut Paul Bosch out of being in charge of the entire Texas promotion. So Paul Bosch basically had one town, which was Houston. So whoever the booker was for Fritz von Erich, the promoter out of Dallas, he would be the booker for San Antonio, would be the booker for Amarillo, for the most part, and they would be the booker for Houston. So Morris Siegel died on 1966. Paul Bosch bought the Gulf Athletic Club from Siegel's widow. At that point, had started, kind of promoting, wrestling on a full-time basis. He spent 21 years promoting wrestling in Houston, mostly out of the Sam Houston Coliseum was kind of their main hub for their bigger shows. But it's basically, like I said, it was that's the way Texas wrestling worked. It was, again, it's very similar to New York because the booking office was in New York with Vince McMahon, but he had his local promoters throughout the Northeast. You know what I mean? So it was a little bit different than the kind of way it evolved into the 80s and what have you. Like, basically, the way the booking office would get a percentage of the towns. But again, it makes that position very attractive because you make a lot of money that way. So when Vince went national, Vince McMahon Jr. went national, one of the big things that he went out public and kind of outed wrestling as being predetermined and what have you was kind of to cut out the local promoters, because there was kind of this rule in place that if you're going to run a show, you need a local promoter to run it with you. Just in case you leave bad debts or that kind of shit, we can get a hold of this person, not to some person from another state or another city. So that's the way it works. So, Vince and whoever was running wrestling would have partners in all these towns that they would run. But when wrestling, when they got away from the commissions and they weren't paying the tax, one of the other things is like they're going to lose, you don't need a local promoter. So they were able to cut, that out. But again, it was very important it's why we're talking about later when Vince partnered up with Paul Bosch in '87. That's why they needed these guys, because they needed local promoters throughout the states. Like most territories by the mid '80s, Houston wrestling kind of fell apart. It kind of split away from Fritz von Erich and World Class and went with the UWF for a while. That didn't work, and then Paul Bosch had left the NWA and joined up with Vince McMahon in the World Wrestling Federation. That lasted for about 4 months, and then he just retired. At that point, he's like, Vince, you can have it. They had the Paul Bosch retirement show, which you can find on YouTube. It was funny because Paul Bosch being the big he was a big name in Houston. He was very important. Where like he's friends with George Bush and that kind of shit. And
right.
Again, a guy that historically known as a good payoff guy, honest dude, straight shooter. Very rarely do you hear anything bad about him, other than Gary Hart. He said some not so kind things about him, but yeah, I mean that's Houston wrestling in a nutshell. The one thing about Houston wrestling that when you think about the overall landscape of professional wrestling in general, you think about these big angles and shit like that, right? Like I can sit here and rattle off angles that happened in WWF, Georgia Championship Wrestling, Jim Crockett Promotions, and Florida, even in St. Louis and Kansas City for a lesser extent, but I can still name angles and shit they did. But I can't think of any notable angles from Houston that just like comes to mind. Like it pops right to my head. I don't really have any that come to mind like right off the top of the bat. Which is really strange to me because again, that's a notable promotion that they used to have these super cards and all this shit, and I find it kind of odd that no angles kind of come to mind on this.
Yeah,
it's weird. I'm sure I'll get some Houston fans on who's like, oh, when this and this happened. But I'm talking about in terms of a national stage or something that we fondly remember. Right. I think overall, he wrote 4 books too. Holy shit. So I think overall, I mean, Houston wrestling is, in terms of territory, it's well known. Although the footage, I've been having a hard time getting footage for it. Just kind of like in preparation for the show. Again, I didn't see the Paul Bosch Super Spectacular retirement show. But that was a Vince show with WWF wrestlers, and we'll get into that in a second because I think that's important too. But then I figured out where all the footage is, and all the footage is at NWAOnDemand.com. They have like all the Houston wrestling footage on their streaming site. So anyone that's interested in Houston wrestling or wants to see some really cool NWA matches, go to NWAOnDemand.com. You'll see some really cool stuff. Again, it's a streaming service. It's $9.99 a month, and they have some really fantastic footage. So if you're super into the NWA, into the 80s and late 70s, I mean, that's definitely a site you should definitely check out. So some of the matches you can see on NWA On Demand. So you can see Nick Bockwinkel versus Tony Atlas, Harley Race versus Wally McDaniel, Harley Race versus Andre the Giant, Race versus Terry Funk for the NWA title, Nick Bockwinkel versus Ricky Morton.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean that's a really cool match. Nick Bockwinkel versus Dusty Rhodes for the AWA title. Harley Race versus Gino Hernandez for the NWA title. I mean, there's lots of cool matches. I definitely, when I get some cash, I'm definitely going to take a look into this. I'll report back and see what I think about it. Because it looks really cool. Apparently, Butch Reed and Dick Slater had a few, but that's more UWF.
Right.
Yeah, not for nothing. While we're on the topic, and I don't know when we're going to talk about him again, but a big star for Houston wrestling was Gino Hernandez. Gino Hernandez is someone that, if he didn't pass away, he probably would have been a ginormous star in wrestling. He was a big star. I'm talking about nationwide. He would have been fantastic. I was watching some of his matches from Southwest. Oh my God, he's amazing. Unbelievably good. Like, I was like, holy shit. Like, he really would have been, like, he passed away in 86 at 28.
Right.
I think Vince would have scooped them up for a tag team run. So he might have been a little too small. Maybe not. He's 6'3", 240.
Was he that tall?
Yeah, I didn't think he was that big.
Wow.
Yeah. But he would have been amazing. One half of the dynamic duo with Tully Blanchard. Trained by Jose and Lothario, who, most of you know, trained for Shawn Michaels.
Right.
Again, his stuff in World Class was amazing, too. The handsome half-breed, as they call them. On the show, you saw a Gino Hernandez versus Ric Flair match, and I think they would have had fantastic matches. And just saying that, I think overall he would have been an amazing talent, and he's someone that definitely left too soon. Now, he passed away in 1986. Apparently, he had died. He overdosed on cocaine. He passed away from a cocaine overdose. But a lot of people saying that he was murdered.
Really?
Like Michael Hayes doesn't think he was murdered. Bruce Pritchard doesn't believe really that he was murdered. Although Bruce Beefcake thinks he just OD'd. So thank you, Brother Brudai, for your thing. So he could have had outstanding cocaine debts, and someone could have killed him, or that kind of stuff, kind of the Dino Bravo type thing. When you're buying illicit drugs, like that, you get to meet some shady people. Now,
right.
So don't do drugs, kids, and you won't get fucking murdered. How about that?
Right.
But he was a awesome talent. He won in I think he would have been a huge star, overall for Vince. So Matt, what do you think about Gino?
Well, I was a Gino fan way back when, and then of course, you also see stuff like you were saying earlier, other matches. There's a lot of wrestlers that you think of over the years that if they hadn't died, what would have happened? He was one of the early ones.
Yeah.
If Bruiser Brody hadn't died, where do you think he would have gone to? If, Eddie Guerrero hadn't died. Like some guys like Chris Candido, they had some demons, and you were kind of like, okay. But other guys that, seem to have all the tools, just wrong place.
And he never really left Texas. He was in Houston, and he was in San Antonio, and he was in World Class. But I don't think he really went out. What it could have done with him in New York, or if he went over to Crockett, it would have been amazing. Memphis even, although he probably wouldn't have made any money. But according to his Wikipedia, he had one match in the WWF, and he worked in Detroit when he was young. But he spent most of his time in Texas. So he born in Texas, yeah. So he was born in Texas. He was a Texas boy, and he wanted to stay there. And Texas is so big, and with 4 promotions and the way they had it, you really didn't have to leave. You could have stayed in Texas the entire time and been fine. Okay. So So if you're watching this right now, hate to spoil anything for you, but Dusty Rhodes wins the NWA World Title by defeating Harley Race. I was fucking shocked when that happened. I was like, holy shit. Again, I don't mess around with the results of the matches. Let the computer handle that. And yeah, Dusty Rhodes wins the NWA World Title. Unbelievable.
About damn time.
Yeah. Who been the he beat Race in 81. No, he beat Race with, I think it was late. I think it was earlier. So I think but Dusty never held the belt very long.
No, I think all of his reigns are pretty short.
Yeah, so Dusty had already beat Race in 79 in Tampa. He also beat him in 81 in Atlanta. And then he held it for a few months, and then Flair beat him in Kansas City. So there you go. So Dusty Rhodes, new NWA World Champion. Let's see if he holds it longer this time than historically been known to do. So,
right.
So okay, guys, we are officially out of time. So for